Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, Seminar Sketch, November 2016, by Sean McHugh. I have a seminar reading with these parts: Nietzsche, Introduction, Influences and Wagner, Tragedy, Euripides and Socrates, Rebirth of Tragedy, Forbidden Planet, and 3 sections from the book. I studied Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy during my music master's degree and have an interest in its notions of the Dionysiac and Apollonian, or the intuition and the intellect, as aspects of mind and as characterizing cultures, and in relation to Richard Wagner's music, which I've explored over many years. I'll look at the basics of what Nietzsche's saying, along with some images and questions. Nietzsche. The Birth of Tragedy is a theory of drama and culture written in 1872 by German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, whose dates are 1844–1900. He was 28, and it was his first published book. He's an important, although controversial, critic of the nature of European or Western culture, this being the thought or way of life of the Caucasian peoples west of Asia, and the lands they settled in, but which can include the Russians across northern Asia. He first studied in Germany at Bonn University, then moved to Leipzig University to focus on philology, or the study of the historical development and meaning of words and languages, particularly Latin and Greek. He was awarded a doctorate here. When he was only 25, he was appointed to the chair of classical philology at Basel University in Switzerland. But 10 years later, poor health caused him to retire and write largely for himself. He produced about 17 books, mostly in aphoristic and metaphorical styles, but remained an obscure figure during his lifetime. He became insane in 1889 when he was 45, possibly from syphilitic brain damage, but arguably exacerbated by various contradictions in his life's work, and spent his final decade mentally and physically incapacitated. He was nursed by his sister, who, after his death, then damaged his reputation by presenting some of his ideas as precursors to Nazism. Her funeral in 1935 was attended by Hitler. Nietzsche's life parallels the ancient Greek tragedy plays that he studied, where a protagonist struggles to make sense of the Dionysiac, or the passions, at the heart of life, before meeting a terrible downfall. Introduction. The Birth of Tragedy was criticized by his peer academics, such that it undermined his career prospects, particularly with its arguments for the Greeks having to deal with background psychological issues, rather than being adjusted and happy people at the heart of Western civilization. He also criticizes Christianity, including arguing for immediate sensory experience being significant, rather than mistrustful. It's further unorthodox in addressing several academic disciplines at once, and is playful, ironical, and poetic, rather than transparently logical. It seems Nietzsche didn't perceive sufficiently well the need to operate within existing paradigms, regardless of being right or not, and he was genuinely taken aback. His subsequent thought moves away from this dichotomy, with the Apollonian becoming less important. He criticized The Birth of Tragedy when a new edition was printed in 1886, with a rambling preface called An Attempt at Self-Criticism. The book became more influential after Nietzsche's death, including for psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud's theory of a balance between the conscious and unconscious, and for philosopher Martin Heidegger, poets T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, and composers Gustav Mahler, Frederick Delius, and Richard Strauss. It's also influenced anthropology. Its central theme is human psychology and experience, being defined by the fundamental Dionysiac and the secondary Apollony, or Apollonian. The Dionysiac is the intuition and immediate understanding, and the Apollonian the intellect and reasoning or calculation. The two drives were deified by the ancient Greeks as Dionysus and Apollo, sons of Zeus, the king of the pantheon of gods. The articulating intellect and Apollonian are paradoxically dreamlike and delusory, as the real nature of reality is one, indivisible and holistic, and hence perceived by the intuition. Here are some other opposing characteristics. They were present in German thought before Nietzsche, But he develops an elaborate argument for ancient Greek dramatic tragedy, or Attic tragedy, centered on the 5th century BCE, being a fusion of the two. Greece was a key influence on Europe in the ancient world, and addressing it helps understanding the rational character of Western civilization generally. The book is broadly divided into two halves, with sections 1 through 13 outlining the interplay of the two forces in terms of earlier Greek myth that leads to the genre of tragic drama. Sections 14 to 25 outline the differences between the age of tragedy and the modern age, with its ascendant Apollonian mind, or theoretical man, that represses the healthy interplay with the Dionysiac. Nietzsche tries to outline how a rebirth of the pre-rational mind can emerge in modern cultural conditions. Moreover, modern Germany was being founded as Nietzsche was preparing his book, involving about 40 minor states merging with Prussia in the north. The new state was declared the year before the book was finished. Hence, the nature of the culture for the new state was an issue of the day. Influences and Wagner. The book is partly influenced by the early 19th century German philosopher Schopenhauer's foremost work, The World as Will and Representation, which Nietzsche encountered in 1865 when he was 21. Schopenhauer argues for poetry and drama with their linguistic nature as expressing the outward phenomenal world, and the Apollonian in Nietzsche's terms. And music, with its entirely abstract sound, expresses the basis of reality as will, and the Dionysiac in Nietzsche's terms. With this in mind, then, Nietzsche argues that tragic drama is born out of the spirit of music and its fundamental nature. The book presupposes the significance of art music and the powerful experiences it can provide. Art music is the greatest achievement of Western civilization, the finest thing it ever did. The Apollonian and Dionysiac also relate to Immanuel Kant's philosophy of the previous century, of our perceptions of the world, plus things in themselves, or the noumenal realm that lies behind. The primary influence on the birth of tragedy, however, is the thought and interest in ancient Greek theater of the major opera composer Richard Wagner, who was 30 years Nietzsche's senior. Nietzsche first met him in 1868 when he was 24 in Leipzig, and over the next 3 years visited Wagner and his partner, Cosima, 27 times at a house on Lake Lucerne in central Switzerland. Sections 16 to 25 at the end particularly express zeal for Wagner's operas as recapturing the great tragic art of ancient Greece. Wagner also wrote a defensive response against one of the book's detractors, but this only made Nietzsche seem like the conveyor of the ideas of a background senior figure. Wagner is one of the greatest minds in Western civilization and worked on artistic projects of extraordinary depth and reach, enormous scale, and technical complexity. His set of operas are at the heart of the entire Western art tradition. He wrote 13 operas, the first 3 being rarely performed, and the second 3 providing a transitional middle period. The last 7 are his main achievement. His music evolves under the impulses of its own material, rather than under traditional forms and processes imposed on the music from without. The resulting lack of intellectual clarity in this has made it controversial. The combination of a holistically conceived form, along with strong linear progression, provides a union of mind between Dionysiac intuition and Apollonian intellect. Wagner's Der Ring des Nibelungen is a work comprising 15 hours of music, divided into a prefacing shorter opera in 1 act, followed by 3 operas in 3 acts each. It took him 27 years to complete, from 1846 to 74. The 4 operas are designed for performance over 4 consecutive evenings, in reflection of the Greek tradition of a shorter opening play, followed by a trilogy of dramas. Other Wagnerian influences on the birth of tragedy includes the sets of musical motifs, comparing with Nietzsche's sets of concepts. This style remains even in his later work, criticizing Wagner, and further characterizes Adorno's style and his Wagner criticism. Also, Wagner's advanced counterpoint, or the combining of multiple melodic lines, parallels the interweaving relations Nietzsche describes between the Dionysiac and Apollonian drives. And the increased dissonance in Wagnerian harmony compares with Nietzsche's juxtaposition of contrasting ideas. All as in Wagner Nietzsche further develops controversial and polemical ideas, shows personal conviction, and reaches for extremes, with the written style having a convulsive Dionysian spirit, and the form then finding continuity with content. Nietzsche taking sides with Wagner and his ideas, lying outside the establishment, however, was risky for his own academic position at Basel. Being away from Germany perhaps added to his confidence in attacking some of its traditions. He argues from his philology studies that metaphors better capture the reality behind appearances, and that all concepts were once metaphors. The elusiveness also parallels that of the early mid-century American transcendentalist movement, with concern for personal insight over institutional intellectualism. His style serves to counterbalance the somewhat turgid academic style of his time, but the combination of classical scholarship with poetic, convoluted arguments and generalizations is nonetheless dubious. He further gives the impression that he often thinks he's too clever to bother explaining properly what he means, instead favoring abstruse expressions and putting words in italics to look cute. In 1861, when Nietzsche was 17, he gained some familiarity with Wagner's masterpiece love story, Tristan and Isolde, finished 2 years before, in a piano reduction, and he acknowledged its aesthetic power throughout his life. He also began learning to compose, although the few works he wrote show limited creativity. Tristan and Isolde can also be argued to have a Schopenhauerian or Buddhist relinquishing of the will, in that both its protagonists die towards the end. However, the opera suggests that it must end tragically, because the protagonists and our present society is flawed, with artistic depictions being a counterweight to this. And in The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche tries to interpret these deaths in terms of his theory of tragedy, where artistic depictions of suffering make life more bearable and understandable for us at any time. He argues that the audience gains redemption by viewing the events artistically, although he later regretted using this religious term. Redemption also characterizes Wagner's librettos, particularly for his final opera Parsifal, with its Christian overtones. Furthermore, Nietzsche also entirely rejects Schopenhauer's call to relinquish the underlying will. In 1876, 4 years after the book was written, however, Nietzsche turned against Wagner and his music, arguing that its lack of transparent formal designs deceived the listener. In The Birth of Tragedy, he argues for renouncing traditional forms, and his rationale for ending his friendship is dubious. The real reasons may have been that he felt that Wagner was occupying a high place he had reserved for himself, or that he had been inadvertently embarrassed by an incident in Wagner's circle. Either way, he came to see Wagner and wider Romanticism as inauthentic and an abnegation of oneself and life, in that without clear forms for art, there is only blind following. Wagner, he argues, is a kind of lying, where the Dionysiac isn't really present. However, he forms a romantic figure himself in being a great striving individual and searching for truth in his own terms. He also criticizes rationalism and takes an interest in human nature independent of modernity, as well as an interest in horror and excess. Tragedy. Greek tragic plays are thought to have developed from religious rites for Dionysus and went on to influence Roman theater and beyond through to the Renaissance. In ancient Greece, prior to the development of tragedy, Nietzsche sees the Dionysiac expressed in music alone or in drunken festivals, and the Apollonian in epic poetry with its articulated ideas, and sculpture with its surfaces and distinct edges. Yet the nature of tragic drama is foreshadowed by Homer's epic poetry of the Iliad and Odyssey of the 9th century BCE, where the gods are depicted taking pleasure in the characters' ordeals and demise. They are brought into the play and don't just observe. In tragedy, the gap with the spectator is fully bridged, and the intellectual workings of literature are balanced by the intuition through the use of music. The surviving tragic works of Aeschylus and Sophocles of the 5th century balance the two modes of mind by means of a musical chorus of singers as representing the ineluctable Dionysian background to human experience, and the dialogue between the characters before them as representing the Apollonian. The ideas about the opposing Dionysiac and Apollonian would then seem to be further influenced by the German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel of the late 18th and early 19th century, with his argument for human development consisting in dialectic processes of thesis and contrasting antithesis, subsequently united in a synthesis of wider understanding. However, Nietzsche holds that Greek tragedy isn't a synthesis of the Dionysiac and Apollonian, with these instead remaining permanently different. There is also no necessary development of the relationship between them across history, and Nietzsche argues that art has a timeless dimension, as well as being an expression of changing society. The chorus, bringing the audience into the stage activity, then undermined their experience of critical distance on the intellectual level, and instead gave them a sense of oneness, freeing them from mistaken notions of being individual selves. The chorus may also have been dressed as satyrs or sexualized goatmen, their instinctual animal nature, indicative of the human mind's dual nature. In modern theater, a chorus may be seen in terms of a lavish addition in more elaborate productions, but Nietzsche sees it as the Dionysiac fundamental to experience. In tragedy, a protagonist emerges from the Dionysian singing chorus and finally returns to it as the ineluctable background reality. They strive against fundamental forces, suffer, and finally and necessarily succumb to them. Intellectual articulated thought develops out of and remains dependent on the intuition. This is reflected in Wagner, where sections of development emerge from, flourish, and submerge back into a holistically interconnected background flow. The semicircular seating around the stage in Greek theaters and their steep design also added to the sense of being part of the play. A similar effect where the audience is drawn in is again found in Wagner's music as a result of its lack of external formal framing. The audience may also have joined in the choral singing, but little is known about Greek music, and only a few written fragments survive. A dithyramb was an ecstatic choral hymn to the god Dionysus. Aesthetic depiction of the protagonist's efforts, downfall, and reabsorption into the groundswell of life shows that life's seeming meaninglessness can be affirmed and transcended into positivity. Art hence justifies life for people now, rather than in the Christian view of justification being deferred to a life to come. Nietzsche here argues for Wagner's view of music, with the words of a drama set to it, as the highest art. Yet purely instrumental music of many kinds has provided the highest aesthetic results. Even Tristan und Isolde works well, even without considering the Apollonian words. The argument is that Dionysian imperatives and experiences are universal, with good art realigning our outer minds with this, while our sense of individuality is illusory. Nietzsche particularly holds that the embrace of life in authentic art should particularly include suffering, and he is against any constraining ideological system or moralizing that treats suffering as intrinsically bad, as traced to the philosopher Aristotle's writings of the 4th century BCE. Nietzsche says that although the problems in life can make it despairing and absurd, the aesthetic experience in art, rather than attention to ultimately groundless Apollonian principles or concepts, helps us access and affirm a deeper reality. Nietzsche, however, seems to have a disregard for the suffering of people. People are ends in themselves and shouldn't be seen a means to anything else, such as aesthetic justification of life in general. He quotes Hamlet saying that Hamlet perceives the Dionysian backcloth beyond his reasoning over what or what not to do, and hence fails to act because whatever he does is meaningless. But Nietzsche contradicts himself here over the intuition's primacy. On the contrary, the Dionysiac is dynamic and can indicate via the intuition what to do. It's not just static and meaningless. Hamlet fails to act because he doesn't perceive it and instead thinks too much. Euripides and Socrates. The works of Euripides subsequent to Aeschylus and Sophocles then disrupt the Dionysiac-Apollonian balance in being influenced by the development of reasoning that then comes to characterize wider European culture, signaled by contemporary philosopher Socrates. Euripides reduces the role of the chorus and encourages wrong-headed audience empathizing with the protagonist and characters. Empathy brings the spectator onto the stage in the wrong way, distinct from the bridge and unity with the audience brought by the chorus, and thus the intuitive sense of form in the previous tragic drama. Euripides is seen as different because he panders to the audience and provides naturalism in place of higher artistic values. Traditionally, the view is often that Euripides is the most edifying of the three playwrights, due to the pity he evokes, but Nietzsche says that suffering is inevitable, and hence pity is a mistaken response. However, Euripides has only one surviving trilogy of plays to be studied, and it also strays from the regular form of tragedy, with Nietzsche providing no analysis of it here. Yet there seems to be a development of Apollonian thought in Western civilization from the late 5th century, including ethical codes based on pity. The subsequent dominant dramatic theory for 23 centuries is also Aristotelian, where the audience reflects on characters' actions by placing them in clear categories of right and wrong. It's no longer at one with the action to perceive its flow on the intuitive level. The rise of rational and dialectical process, along with repression of the Dionysiac, is dated to Socrates, with Aristotle and Plato his immediate successors. Since his time, art and culture have been out of balance and in decline. It seems that the Greeks were looking to control Dionysian impulses in terms of social chaos, but following the age of tragedy, Europe went on to control those impulses until they disappeared under the surface entirely. In the West's post-Socratic Apollonian culture, abstracted reasoning attends to isolated parts of reality and denies the interconnected whole perceived by the intuition. Rebirth of tragedy. Nietzsche finally argues that traditional opera fails to unite the Dionysiac and Apollonian, in comprising only an alternation of recitative, or non-melodic sections of dialogue in minimal orchestration, with melodic arias, where the characters are more reflective. Wagner's operas, by contrast, provide a rebirth of tragedy and balance, because the two forces are present simultaneously. Articulated rather than melodic vocal lines provide the Greek dramatic dialogue, while a rich orchestral bass stands for the chorus. The dissolving of traditional formal structures further makes the music's flow more intuitive and less consciously calculated, and brings in the audience to provide a sense of oneness comparable with Greek tragedy. Just a few years later, though, Nietzsche was arguing against Wagner's evolving formal designs as being fraudulent and obfuscating. Instead, he began advocating works like Bizet's Carmen, with its alternating sections and transparent, symmetrical, and pre-compositional forms. Ultimately, his mind was hypocritically guided by surface intellectualism and conceptualizing, rather than by the Dionysiac. Nietzsche subsequently tried unhappily to make sense of his self-contradictions and repudiation of Wagner, going on to address and condemn him more than any other figure. Wagner died in 1883, during Nietzsche's late writing. Nietzsche and later figures, including Theodor Adorno, can't explain the unique conviction and ruthless assurance of Wagner's music. If it was only arbitrary and rhapsodical, propped up with meaningless, grandiose gestures, it ought to sound aimless to serious listeners, but instead it's understood as some of the finest art in humanity's possession. As outlined in The Birth of Tragedy, Wagner was providing the formal process to allow the Apollonian, or outward thought, to emerge entirely out of the Dionysiac, or out of the spirit of music. However, this achievement became too much for Nietzsche, and he backed away and became spiteful and hateful. Wagner saw through him and never took his denunciation seriously, and his work, by contrast, was never influenced by anything Nietzsche wrote. As an example of Nietzsche losing his way, He describes more Apollonian music as rhythmically pronounced, in contrast to melodic Dionysian. But the definition in music of the visceral Dionysiac is Stravinsky's highly rhythmic rather than melodic The Rite of Spring of 1913 for orchestra. One of his later ballets is Apollo, which has elegance and transparent textures. Forbidden Planet. The best film ever made is Forbidden Planet of 1956, which features in part a depiction of Nietzsche and his struggles with the Dionysiac and Apollonian. I recommend it to widen the perspective here. I prepared a 12,000-word analysis of it, which is also in video form on YouTube, although the audio results aren't great. Forbidden Planet is also influenced by Shakespeare's The Tempest and the similar storm in the mind of its protagonist, Prospero. It provides an enormous cultural challenge in outlining the mistaken prioritization of the subservient Apollonian in wider Western civilization. The character Morbius is a philologist studying the records of an extinct alien race called the Krell in parallel with the ancient Greeks, but whose end results of extraordinary technology, social development, and rational thinking power was their destruction. They had maintained a civilization of material progress for 1,000,000 years, based on the intellect, and finally built a great machine to dispense with regular machines and create anything directly from thought. However, they mistakenly saw Apollonian thought as providing for their advanced world to be the mind's basis, when it's secondary and without real grounds. And once they switched on the machine, it completely bypassed it straight to the primary Dionysiac. Monstrous entities were created as expressions of instinctive tendencies of the subconscious Dionysiac of the population that they had never dealt with properly, and instead had only been repressed by their culture. They were suddenly free to be their visceral selves and destroyed each other. They needed to have coordinated their intellectual workings with the Dionysiac's terms and attended to their contradictions and denials. They had buried and disparaged the Dionysiac through technological society and abstract principles of shining sanity and high benevolence. Section 1. In Section 1, Nietzsche outlines some psychological ideas, particularly that intuitive perception is distinct from conceptual understanding, and that there are two main forces or drives in the mind. The Dionysiac is the fundamental and lies beneath Apollonian reasoning, but the two modes interact and strive against each other to create both art and history. He also compares the modes to the two sexes, and hence suggests that human nature is more related to biology than intellectual development. There may be an influence here from Charles Darwin's evolutionary theory, The Origin of Species, of 1859, which appeared in a German translation the next year. There was a debate over whether laws of biological development might also be applicable to culture and history. Among the arts, the Dionysiac is most given by music, and the Apollonian by some literature, along with sculpture and architecture. He mentions the choral finale of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, with its group singing and oneness with other people, as an example of Dionysian music. This music also sets an optimistic text called Ode to Joy by the 18th century poet and thinker Friedrich Schiller, who Nietzsche admires. Section 10. Myth can say something timeless without having to make claims to historical fact. Post-Socratic culture, with its history-based religion, however, has downplayed myth. In Section 10, Nietzsche speaks of myths where the god Dionysus is torn apart, comparing with the mistaken sense of individuation instead of unity in culture following Socrates and Euripides, but then is remade together, comparing with a future return of culture in balance. Nietzsche describes the 3 or 4 centuries of Homeric epic poetry prior to Sophocles and Aeschylus as having Apollonian ascendancy, similar to the modern world, and with the 2 great tragic playwrights only providing an interlude. Section 16. Section 16 begins Nietzsche's theory of modern art, particularly music, looking at the prospects for a rebirth of the mind in balance in relation to Wagner. He recaps on the combative nature of the two forces of nature and acknowledges his indebtedness to both Schopenhauer, with his notion of underlying reality as will, and Wagner with his interrelated motifs rather than closed forms, reflecting the mind's workings. He also notes that attending to the Dionysiac and its universality is an acknowledgement of the notion of eternal life. Music can bring us in touch with the inner dynamics of life experience, beyond the rational mind, and in this, Wagner is the new hope for an authentic integration of music with drama, along with poetry and myth, in his notion of the total artwork. However, in the 20th century, mass culture came to dominate over high culture, and also over any pre-modern folk culture, and hence Nietzsche and Wagner would no longer seem to have the means for improving human existence. Any further thoughts?